Okay. Good morning, everyone. You know, if I knew we were going to be in this lounge, I'd have worked on my Sinatra act instead of this. I was getting ready, I told Pete when we set up I was going to be on the floor and I was going to walk back and forth. The ship started moving so much this morning when I got up, I figured I'll stay still and let the ship move underneath me. It's a hell of a lot easier, you know. Well, my name is Fred Rice. I'm a member and past president of Chapter 54 in Boston, although now I live in Cary, North Carolina, about an hour and a quarter north of a place called Fort Bragg. I'm sure you've heard of it. And it will always be Fort Bragg. And what I'd like to do this morning is share a few stories with you about some people that I've been fortunate enough to call my good friends. They have become icons in the Special Forces community, and many of you know some of them, if not all of them. But these are little stories, no big exposés, no tell-alls, none of that stuff. Just incidents that happened that are interesting, that might help you understand a little bit more about the personalities of some of these people. So without further ado, we'll start with the first one. Colonel Nick Rowe. Now, for those few of you here who don't know who Nick Rowe is, Nick was a Special Forces officer who was captured by the BC in October of 1963. He was held prisoner in a bamboo cage down in the Delta for more than 5 years. He escaped, later wrote a book about his experiences. He left active duty, came back for the purpose of establishing the SEER course, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And later in an assignment in the Philippines, he was assassinated by communist guerrillas. Now, a lot of you know who Nick Rowe is. How many of you have read his book, 5 Years to Freedom? Almost everybody here, wonderful. How many of you have been through the SEER course? Good number, excellent, you know him even better. How many of you have served with him, actually served with him? Good. And how many of you know him outside of that, know him in other manners? Good. So everybody's very familiar with Nick. Well, I'm going to tell you stuff that you've never heard about Nick, okay? First of all is, well, I'm going to tell you about a half a dozen stories about Nick. I'm going to tell you about Dassels. I'm going to tell you about sports cars and skydiving. I'm going to tell you about bug-out bags. Let's see, then we'll go to the class of '88 and Arlington and the congressional record. So we'll start with Dassels. And by the way, before I do this, you know, you guys all know because you've met, so many of you have met Nick and know a little bit about him, but I've asked a lot on social media and everything else, what was Nick like and everything else. A lot of people imagine he was like Rambo because he did so many wonderful things. Well, Nick was just the exact opposite of Rambo. He was small, slight of build, very low key. I don't think I ever heard Nick yell once at all. But he had a very engaging personality. He was very intense. He was very motivated. He was a man of great faith. And the biggest thing about Nick is that picture right there. He had the most engaging smile anybody I ever knew. When we were lieutenants at Fort Sill, we'd go down to Dallas and date the airline stewardesses down at Love Field. And we'd throw parties and everything else. All the guys were trying to put the make on the girls. All the girls were trying to put the make on Nick. They thought he was cute. They wanted to mother him. So, but that, you know, some guys are lucky and some aren't. But it's okay, we'll start with Dassels. Dassels is the story of how Nick and I and a bunch of other people got into Special Forces. It's very unique. I don't think anybody else has followed this same path ever. Usually the West Point classes go through 60 days of graduation leave. Then they go to their branch. They go to their branch school. Then they go to airborne, and if they want to, they go to Ranger. Well, in my class, 95% wanted to go both airborne and Ranger, so that would have clogged up the pipeline. So they decided to take the artillery guys, switch us backwards, and we came off of graduation leave straight into Ranger school in August. Then we went to jump school, then to the artillery course. We were at Fort Sill in the spring of 1961. Well, a lot of people don't realize that at that time, at the same time, the Special Warfare Center wanted to try and use PAC-75 howitzers as a support weapon for guerrilla operations, unconventional warfare. So they requested 25 captains. They were going to be team leaders and teach tactics and stuff like that. Artillery branch wasn't about to give 25 perfectly good captains into something that was considered an experimental branch that was a career ender. And at that time in the early 60s, it was. So they said, I know, we got second lieutenants, let's send down. So they got us into a big room, and no big sales pitch. They just said, if you want to volunteer for special forces, it's kind of mostly infantry. We don't know a lot about it, but we'll change your orders and you can go there instead. Well, I was going to go to Germany. Nick was going to go to the 82nd. But when they said that, mine was the first hand that shot up. I had spent a summer as a cadet at Fort Bragg, and I knew just about enough about special forces to be dangerous, really dangerous. But I thought, this is going to be fun. So I raised my hand. I looked over at Nick, and his hand went right up after mine. So I want to tell you, you are looking at the first second lieutenant to ever volunteer for special forces without having been enlisted SF and gone through OCS first. I'm the very first one. Nick was the second one. So that was, we were early. Now, another 15 hands went up. We had 17 of us. And then we picked up another guy from artillery OCS. He had not been SF. And we all reported into Fort Bragg on the 5th of May, 1961. Same day that Alan Shepard became the first American in space, if you want to date this. Now this is the, there's the smile right there. This is the Fort Bragg that you guys know, most of you know. And it's a big city, and it's got a lot of big stone buildings and everything else. That's looking west, right down Gruber Road, and that's Smoke Bomb Hill right there. Well, when we reported in, it looked like this. Now, give you a little bit of background on what the place was like at that time. Right now, Special Forces is in its 8th decade, well into its 8th decade. We reported in before it had finished its 1st decade. And that's a long time ago. I don't want to say that I'm old, but you know the old expressions they used to use in the Army that are politically incorrect now about age. How long has he been around? Since Christ was a corporal. Do you remember that one? How long has he been around? Since Hitler was a road guard. Another one was a favorite. And the other one was older than dirt. Well, I'm not older than dirt, but I will tell you that when the first load of dirt was put in place, I was on the inspection team to make sure it was done right. So this is a while ago. Everything, now let's see if this laser will work on this screen right here. Yeah. Okay, the 7th Group headquarters was right about here on the corner of Rodney Road. I think there's a Burger King there right now. Yeah. And the 82nd Band headquarters is next door to it. No respect, like Rodney Dangerfield. Well, when we reported in there, it was kind of unique. Right now, Special Forces has 23,000. Well, Special Forces has 23,000 troops. It's the largest single troop unit in the Army. When we reported in the entire Special Warfare Center, it had 2,300. There were 3 groups only: the 1st, the 10th, and the 7th. 7th was only 6 months old. They still thought they were the 77th. But we came in there at that time. Now they've got sustainment brigades. When we were there, sustainment was whatever you could put in your ruck and carry on your back. Big difference. So we reported in upstairs. All these old buildings used to have these upstairs briefing rooms in the headquarters. We're all sitting there, 17 of us. We're all decked out in our short sleeve khakis with jump wings and ranger tabs and artillery brass and 2nd lieutenant bars. Well, we're waiting, and all of a sudden up the stairs comes this guy, stomping up the stairs, loud, obnoxious sounding, and I don't know what kind of welcome you got into Special Forces. What we heard was, we don't know I'm going to clean this up a little bit. We don't know where the F you came from, and we don't know who the F sent you, and we don't know what the F you think you're doing here, but we sure as shucks don't want you. You don't know anything, you don't know a goddamn thing. You're nothing but a bunch of goddamn dumbass 2nd lieutenants, and we're going to do everything we can to get rid of you. That was Lieutenant Colonel Rusty Riggs. I don't know if any of you know him. He was the deputy commander of the 7th Group. Well, we kind of sat there, and Nick and I looked at each other and said, what the hell are we doing here? We didn't know what we'd gotten ourselves into. So Colonel Russell, who was the incoming group commander at that time, said, look, we're stuck with you. We're gonna have to keep you, so we're gonna put you through training. So all of us lieutenants went through the MOS courses. So all you enlisted guys that went through all the MOS training, we did it too. But Nick grabbed onto all that stuff with a vengeance. He loved it. He got it, everything we did, he got into it more and more, and he learned as much as he could about it. You know, when I read his book, I was just amazed at how, I mean, we've been through the same experiences. I was amazed at how he could think about how to do things like, you eat charcoal when you get the runs, when you get diarrhea, so it'll tighten you up a little bit. We never learned that anyway. I don't know where he learned it, but he did. Well, anyway, we did the MOS training, we spent some time there at Bragg, and then after a few months, they sent half of us out to the Army Language School in Monterey. Before it was the Defense Language Institute. It was this humble Army Language School. There were 9 of us, 3 of us took Thai, I was one of them. Nick took Chinese Mandarin. Well, while we were out there, we took up a couple of extracurricular activities. One of them was sports car racing and another one was skydiving. I don't want to say it was early, but if you'll note on here, this is my registration card, 1962. My license was C304, and I mean, these were very early. The Parachute Club of America, the Fort Ord Parachute Club. We had scrounged a couple of T-7 chutes from Pope Air Force Base before we went out there. There was a master sergeant, special forces guy who knew how to modify them. So he modified them for us, and the chutes that we used, some of you will cringe when you see this. They were Air Force T-7 non-ripstop nylon, and this was the state of the art for skydiving. This was it. That was a 5-bore TU, and then if you wanted, you could put some extra holes in here, and they 2 or 3 or 4 holes, and another hole up here, and they called it the blowhole special. They were great for turning fast and maneuvering, but every time you turned, you'd lose about an extra 200 feet in one 360 revolution. So it made for some rather solid landings, let's say. The uniform for skydiving back then was a white pair of coveralls and an eggshell helmet. It's what everybody wore. And things like flat canopies and stuff like that, flat parachutes and ram, whatever the hell they call them, those things were years down the line, years down the line. So we were in kind of the stone age of skydiving in there. I think Orange, Massachusetts had their first meet 3 or 4 years after this. This is the chute that we were jumping. Now, one of the things that, up until today, there have only been 3 people, my wife, myself, and another one of the lieutenants, that knew that Nick came within inches of being killed in a mid-air collision. We were jumping this kind of chute, and he came down. The other guy, Bill Bailey, who later became Charlie Beckworth's exec officer, by the way. Bill Bailey came down, opened up like this, and Nick went right through his chute right here. Tore off the lower lateral band, blew out about 3 or 4 panels. Somehow, Bill came in on his main. He didn't have to pop the reserve, but he landed really hard. He's laying on the ground, everybody runs over to him. Nick landed safely someplace else. And he looks up and he says, "Oh God, not again." The next 2 guys out of the same plane, the same thing happened. One guy opened and the other guy went right through. I don't know what the odds are of that, but it's not very often that you're going to see that 2 mid-air collisions out of 1 small aircraft. Now let me step back just a second. When Colonel Riggs called us dumbass second lieutenants, after a while, when we kind of took that name on, and we called ourselves the Dassels, D-A-S-L-S, dumbass second lieutenants. Now, those of you who might have read the Sentinel from chapter 78, or the latest issue of the Drop, there's an article in there that I wrote about the history of the Dassels, and I invite you all to go look and see a little bit more about it. You'll see it was quite a unique group. And we didn't do a lot, but we did a lot of paving the way for a lot of other people. We're very, very proud of that. Okay, the other thing that we did out at Monterey, Nick and I raced sports cars. His was the one on top, mine was the one on the bottom, exact same car. And we used to take those roads as fast as we possibly could. And there was one particular S-turn on the road between Carmel and Pacific Grove, if those of you are familiar with that area. And we took this one S-turn at about 55 miles an hour. Well, unbeknownst to me, Nick gets his car in the shop and gets a lot of work done on it. Racing clutch, gets a ports match, triple wound valve springs, a stabilizer bar, things like that. Takes me for a ride and says, come on, let's go. He took that turn at 70 miles an hour, and I think I left a mark on his upholstery. I mean, I could not have believed, but he did it, and all he did, and this was typical Nick Rowe, all he did when we got through that turn, we pulled over to the side, and he just looks at me and smiles that smile, that Nick Rowe smile. Excuse me, ma'am, I'm sorry, but I can't concentrate if your kids are gonna make a noise. If you can't keep them quiet, I would appreciate it very much. Don't mean to be mean, but I gotta concentrate here. Thank you. Okay, the next thing I'm gonna talk to you about is bug out bags. Now, when we were in Ranger School, this is the cover of the book from my Ranger class. And you'll notice on here that this guy, in addition to being armed with the latest in weaponry, the M14, he also has up here a little thing on his harness. It's called a Ranger kit. It's a plastic soap dish, and you put in there survival stuff. Fishing line, fish hooks, razor blades, snake bite kit, a mirror, stuff like that. And you duct taped it to your harness. Well, when we finally got back to Bragg and went through UW school, that was a 20-year predecessor of the Q course. UW school was essentially the same thing that Colonel Bank learned in Jedburgh. We learned how to do sabotage, interdiction, demo work, communication, interrupt communications, and that was it. We didn't do all this other stuff, counterinsurgency and intelligence, all this other stuff, that's all new. We were very, very basic. So our course was only 6 weeks long. So we had 4 weeks in the classroom, 2 weeks in the field. Nick knew we were going to the field, and he says, we've got to get ready for this. So he takes me down to Fayetteville one day, and we go to the Army Navy stores, and he says, let's find something that would make a better Ranger kit. So we came up with a couple of Army musette bags from World War II. We put all the stuff from the Ranger kit in there, plus we put in a couple of cans of sterno, a little aluminum pot, a little burner unit, and some medical supplies, and a whole bunch of dehydrated food. Oh, okay, we're all set, ready to go. So when we're out on the FTX, this is way before Robin Sage. I don't know if Robin Sage had been born then, I don't know. No, only kidding. But we're out in the field somewhere southwest of Fort Bragg, and Nick and I get the assignment. We buddied up. We were like Ranger buddies, only this was UW buddies. And we got the assignment to go measure a bridge at Camp McCall for demo. It was a wooden bridge. It's now replaced by a nice steel and concrete bridge. But we went out there, sat underneath, measured the bridge. We're getting ready to leave, and all of a sudden he spots some aggressor forces. Those are the OPFOR now. And those are the guys who used to wear dark green uniforms, and they had a little vein on the top of their helmet liner that they wore that identified them as the bad guys. Well, he spotted them, and he gives me some hand and arm signals that says, you go, I'll stay, and then we'll switch. So I ran, he hid. Then when they started coming toward me, I hid and he ran, and so we split them apart. Well, about the time I hit the, what is it, the creek out there, there's a creek that goes right by.
Holmes Fork.
Whatever one it is, it's from the one on the east side.
Yeah.
I hit that thing like it was a 4-lane highway, and it was all brambles and everything else. I went in as far as I could, then I stopped dead. Waited, it was right at dusk. No Nick. Waited some more, no Nick. I made it back around 9 o'clock at night, something like that. No Nick, all night long. Next day, Nick comes wandering in around noon. So where the hell you been? He says, well, they were after me. I hid. They couldn't see. It was too late for me to go anywhere, so I waited. This morning I got up early, came back, and on the way, I was taking a break by a fence, and I saw a rabbit going down a hole. So I took the stuff in our bug-out bag, and I made a snare, and I caught the rabbit. I made a little fire, cooked the rabbit, and used all the stuff in the bug-out bag. I had rabbit stew with Tabasco sauce for breakfast. What did you have? And that was Nick. He was, and then again, he just smiled. He never ever said, I did it better than you, or he never lorded it over anybody. It was all just the satisfaction. He knew that he could do it. And he was into it so much more than anybody else was. But he took a great satisfaction from doing that. So you might be interested. This is the school that we went to. The unconventional, the Special Forces Officer course, and the signatures, I don't know if you can make them out down there, the one on the lower left is Bull Simon, and the one, when it was a lieutenant colonel, and the one on the right is General Yarborough. So that was a few days ago. After that, we went back to, we were assigned to teams back at Bragg, and we were hoping to get on a team that was going to Vietnam. At that time, it was like, it's the only war we got, it ain't gonna last long, so we better get over there while we can. Not kidding. But I got on a team that went over before him. So, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this book by Steve Sherman. He's from Texas, he's a member of the association. He did a phenomenal amount of research to determine everybody that had been to Vietnam from the 1st and the 5th groups. And this next page here will show you a few things of interest. Now, right up here, this is Jake Jacobson right here. These are the teams in order that they went to Vietnam. In the order they went. That's Jacobson. This is my team, Captain Anderson. We went to a little village called Tuk Trung. We were the 11th, I was on the 11th team to go to Vietnam from the 5th group. That was early. That was early. Now, go down a little bit farther. This is Nick's team, Captain Lice. That was his team 6 months early. Right after this, here's a guy you might know, Lee Mize, Team Leader. Ola Mize. Lee Mize, Medal of Honor from Korea, phenomenal guy. Hellraiser of the First Order when he was a captain. He cleaned up pretty good. But I want to tell you, I've seen him clean out in a fight. I've seen him clean out the 82nd Airborne Officers Club before. And he and a buddy of his by the name of Frishy, who went right before him, I think. But and another guy that you might notice the name, recognize the name, his name is Sidney Shacknow. Everybody heard that name before? And he went about a year and a half after I did. So these were the early teams that went over up until 1964. The first had a similar rotation, and Steve Sherman has all of that info. And you can look him up online. It's Radix Corporation, R-A-D-I-X. Look that up and you'll see him. Now, when I went over, when my 6 months were up, Nick got on a team that came over afterwards. And the plane that he came over on was the same plane that took me home. If that isn't a coincidence, I don't know what is. But it was the last time I saw him. This was in July of '63, and he was captured in October, just a couple months later. So, and that's just about my favorite picture. There's a copy of this hanging somewhere in Bank Hall. I don't know where, but it's there. Now, a couple of years later, we're talking about bug-out bags. I had a subscription to this magazine, Outside Magazine, and this particular issue was 1956, I think October of 56, of 86, I mean, October of 86. And in there, I'm thumbing through, and I see this article, Survivors, and it's an article about Nick Rowe. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was Colonel Rowe's survival kit. And guess what it was? It was the bug-out bag. The same damn thing that he and I invented before we went on our training. So I've inquired of a couple guys, oh yeah, we had those when we went through the SEER course. And that's where it came from. Before we went out, Nick says, come on down, let's get a bag and put some stuff in it. So it's another thing that, he was so ingenious in doing this. He came up with a list of things we were gonna put in there. I just, hey, yeah, okay, we're buddied up. You make the rules and I'll follow you. And he did a great job at it too. Okay, the next item is the class of '88. In 1985, Nick and I went to our 25th reunion at West Point. And my son happened to be a cadet at that time. And at my request, he gave my son an autographed copy of his book. And I said, my son read it and he passed it around to all the guys in his company. Well, one of the guys in his company was their class president of the class of '88. So a couple years later, when it's time to pick their graduation speaker, not the one that's at the graduation ceremony, but the one that cadets picked themselves at their graduation banquet, they picked Nick Rowe. The book had been passed around to so many people it became a cult classic with that class at West Point. So my son got the job of asking me or directing me to contact Nick and invite him. You can't realize how difficult it used to be before the days of smartphones and cell phones, when all you had was the white pages, landlines, and somebody that knew somebody who knew something else. And it took a long time, but I located Nick. He was at, he went to a half dozen different places before he went to the Philippines. I contacted him. He was at Wright Pat Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, going through an intel course. And I invited him, and he said, I'd love to. He says, it's the greatest honor that I have ever had in my life to be invited to speak to a class at West Point, a graduating class. That very few people get to do that. And he realized the importance of it. He said, but I'm so far into the pipeline on this, I can't possibly get out of it. So we had a chance to talk for an hour and a half on the phone. It's the last time I talked to Nick before he was captured. And during that conversation, he said, I'm on a hit list. You are? Yeah. Now, a lot of you have probably heard that there were rumors that they were going to hit some VIP, and he found that out after he got to Manila. No. He knew that he was the man on the hit list before he ever went. And I said, well, what are you going to do? And he comes out, typical Nick Rowe. Well, I can't not go. So he went over, and as you know, the tragic result was that he was assassinated in a drive-by shooting by a couple of communist guerrillas. So his book, 5 Years to Freedom, was the thing that initiated all of that with his potential talk at West Point. Now, when Nick died, the officers of my class at West Point contacted me. They knew we were close friends, and they asked me to give them a recommendation as to who should be give the eulogy at his funeral at Arlington. You know, he had 3 full-blown formal military funerals. One at Clark Air Force Base, one at Fort Bragg, that was attended by, according to the Fayetteville Examiner, 800 people. And then the Washington Examiner said the one at Arlington, the one at Arlington was another 800 people. I was at that one. There were about 200 of our West Point classmates there. There were, the entire chain of command was there. The White House Chief of Staff was there, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Army, all of the Joint Chiefs. I think half the guys at Fort Bragg came back up again, and it was really, really quite an event. And I recommended that the eulogy be given by a guy by the name of Bert Spivey. He had been Nick's Ranger buddy, and he had retired. I did not retire. I left service before retirement, so I couldn't wear a uniform. It had to be somebody in uniform. So Bert agreed to do it, and he gave the eulogy, and it was a wonderful eulogy. It was really inspiring. But when they took film of it, they took the eulogy that the chaplain gave, and they missed Bert's. We didn't know that till later. After the graveside service, I'm walking back up toward the chapel, and I find myself walking between 2 very notable people. On my left is Congressman Bob Dornan, one of the biggest supporters of the military in Congress at that time. The guy on my right was Dan Pitzer. I thought, wow. So we talked about Nick. It was a fairly long walk. We talked about Nick, and then Congressman Dornan said, I would like to get a copy of that eulogy. You probably know that guy that gave it, don't you? And I said, yeah, I picked him. And so he said, I'd like to get a copy of it to put in the congressional record. Well, I got a hold of Bert, got the thing, sent it to him. And if you look in the congressional record right now, this is what you'll see. And it says, if I can see it here even, for Robert Dornan, but it says in honor of Colonel James Nicholas Rowe. The cover of that congressional record looks like this. And it's volume 135, and the date is the 101st Congress, and the date is in July what is that, 89. Now, the one that, oops, what happened there? What did I hit? What did I hit, Pete? I lost it. Hit the wrong button. Go get it. There you go. Okay, thank you. Okay, but if you go to this one, the one that I got for Dornan looked quite different. When you put it in, this is the one that Dornan gave me, and this is from the, oops. This is the one, up here it says, in honor of Colonel James Nicholas. They left off his last name. So congressmen are never wrong, and that's why they corrected it and got it to the correct one. Little bit of really in the weeds trivia, but Congress made a mistake with regard to Nick Rowe. Whoops, there we go. Congress made a mistake with regard to Nick Rowe. A few years later, I went down to McCall and had a picture taken next to my dear friend Nick Rowe. He was a hell of a man. And I don't think there'll ever be another one quite like him. I think all of you who know him, you know, when you see him see his name online, 200 people jump on there and say, I knew him, I met him, I saw him, I heard with him, I served with him, something like that. And that's attested by in here. All of you have had a contact with Nick some way or another. It's worth the contact. Okay, let's keep moving on here. Next, we're going to talk about Susan Rowe. Nick died in 1989. And at that time, I lived in Southern California. And in Southern California, there was a huge church there called the Crystal Cathedral. Some of you may have heard of it. And it was a mega church, held several thousand people. And the pastor there, Robert Schuler, you can see down on the right side, you can see his picture on the Jumbotron there. Every Sunday, he would bring somebody in who would talk about how their faith had gotten through difficult situations. And on Memorial Day of 1991, he had Susan Rowe as his guest. Well, she came in, did a phenomenal job, and I think it was very, very appropriate. Good composure, she had a very spirited, very inspirational talk and everything else. Well, afterwards, we went to lunch. And this is Susan with my wife and myself, and the other guy over there with the beard is Bert Spivey, the guy who had given the eulogy. While we were at lunch, one of the things that Susan told us was she was starting to get bugged by a lot of people who wanted to write books and do plays and movies and musicals and everything else. She had gotten a script for an entire movie. It's called High Risk Duty. And she said, would you guys look at it and help me with some of this stuff? And so we started doing that, and there were several over the years. And to this day, if something comes, like about 3 years ago, she sent me an email and said, we got another one. And it was somebody who wanted to write a book, who was really enthused about it, and I went to some great lengths. Susan says, Nick wrote his book, he told his story, that's it. It cannot be told by anybody else again. Nobody else knew him before he was a POW. I probably knew him as well as or better than anybody. Some of his West Point classmates, other classmates and roommates knew him better. And certainly nobody knew him afterwards better than she did. So she said, no more. So for the last 30 plus years, I've been her gatekeeper. And if anybody here wants to decide that they want to write a book about Nick Rowe, you're gonna have to come through me. And you ain't gonna make it. Okay. Now, this, I think, is the first time that she ever met Colonel Bank. She hadn't been anywhere since Nick's death. And Colonel Bank was an old guy in Southern California, and he had not been back east. If he did, he might have gone to one of the conventions back there, but I don't think so. This was the first time that they met at the Crystal Cathedral. And there were also some other folks there from the chapter. There's myself and Bert Spivey down in the front, and Susan and the Colonel. The guy on the right is Ralph Lecon, one of the stakeholders, one of the founders of the Special Forces Association, and other members of Chapter 12, the Catherine Bank chapter. By the way, Catherine Bank, what a beautiful lady, wonderful lady. Okay, let's fast forward to the cookout. In 2002, Special Forces Association had its 50th anniversary at Fort Bragg. And they had the big, they had the big cookout and everything out there. Some of you probably have been to that. And I was planning to go. I was the president of the chapter at that time, so I contacted Susan and I urged her to attend. And she said, I haven't been to much of anything in the whole time since Nick's gone. Maybe it's about time for me to get out. So she came to that cookout, and she brought her two sons, Alex and Brian. Now they were just barely into their teens at that time, and she wanted them to have a little appreciation of what their dad had done for a living. And they knew that he was a hero, but they didn't really know much about what his job was. So they came out, and while she was talking to other people, Jimmy Jackson, who was a POW with Nick, was there also, and she got a chance to see him. Some other folks that she knew from the Special Forces community. She still lived in Fayetteville. And so I took the boys around, and we went around to see the weapons demo and the camo and all the other stuff. And there was an airborne demo. And I'm walking them around the grounds and showing them all this stuff. And while we're out there, we bump into two very well-known people, Gary Bykirk and Roger Donald. And I introduced the boys to the two of them. And I said, this is really an honor for them to be able to meet you. And Bykirk says, and I don't know how or why, he says, oh no, it's our honor to meet them. Their dad did more for Special Forces than we or anybody else could ever have done. He was a bigger influence than we ever could be. It's our honor. I thought that was a hell of a statement. Very humble and very appropriate. Somebody else that they saw there in 2002 was Colonel and Mrs. Bank. So we had the boys get their picture with them. Colonel Bank passed away just a couple years later in 2004. But another 10 years forward, we had the 50th anniversary of the Dassels, and when we reported in, the term Dassel we kept, and to this day, we still call ourselves the Dassels. It's a very small group. There are 8 of us left out of the 18, and we get together, 4 of us are together at least once a month on a Zoom meeting that we talk about the military and Army football and politics and all kinds of stuff. But we still stay in touch all this time, and we still call ourselves the Dassels. So we got a couple of us together. I put the word out, and we went down to Bragg, and here's Alex Rowe, Nick's son, in the center there, and that's at the museum exhibit at the Airborne Museum down in Fayetteville. They had a special big exhibit about Nick's captivity. And so this is 50 years later, and Alex and Susan accompanied us too, and they appreciated the hell out of being able to go with us. Alex was finally getting to hear the war stories about his dad from all of his buddies. And it was great for us, because we enjoyed telling them, everybody here in that group, and it wasn't all of them, the group, but everybody that was there had a few stories to tell about Nick and what they did here and there and the other place. So they really enjoyed it. And then we went out. I won't go forward. There it is, okay, I did it the other way. We also went out to Camp McCall when they were putting the rock in place. Ever see the orange fencing around there? They took that down so that we could get the picture taken. The orange fencing is laying down there. They were still building that facility right there. So we got in there in good timing. Later that night, we went to a banquet, the convention banquet. Susan came with us. She got introduced separately, got a standing ovation very appropriately, and the rest of us enjoyed the dinner as well. And at the end, we had a picture taken with a contemporary of ours, the guy you saw up on the previous slide, Sidney Shatnow. He was the featured speaker that night, and we got a chance to get a picture taken with him. Now, fast forward again to 2015. I don't know, many of you know about the Hotel Thayer at West Point, very well-known place. Well, a number of years ago, they instituted a program to have the rooms named for famous people, MacArthur, Eisenhower, Patton. And two of the rooms are named for Rocky Versace, who was Medal of Honor, who was captured with Nick, and Nick. And Susan contacted me and said, God, they want all this stuff. They want a half a dozen pictures, they want captions and everything else. She said, give me a hand with that. So I worked with her and we went through all of the pictures and everything else. I put together the caption for the plaque that's on the door and everything else. And then they had a ceremony up there at the hotel. And this is Alex on the left. Next to him is General Les Beavers, who stayed with Nick for 6 months after he escaped to help bring him back into society on a normal basis. There's Susan to the right, I'm on the far right, and a couple of the other classmates that are in there. So this is, there, and that's the plaque that's on the door at the Hotel Thayer. The next person we're going to talk a little bit about is Colonel Aaron Bank, a man who needs no introduction in this group. I first met Colonel Bank I first met Colonel Bank at the Crystal Cathedral when Susan came to speak. And we're chatting there, and I was caught in this picture, and he says, do you belong to the association, Fred? And I said, no, sir, I don't know what the association is. He says, it's the Special Forces Association. If you're a former Special Forces officer, you ought to belong to it. When the colonel tells me to do it, I do it. So I joined the association. I went to the chapter meetings, chapter 12, the Catherine Bank chapter, and I found out pretty soon that I lived closer to Colonel Bank than anybody else in the chapter. So when we had events like the Christmas party, I was the designated driver. And I would drive down to San Clemente, pick him up, and we'd have our Christmas parties out at March Air Force Base at the Officers Club out there. Well, when we got there, the first time we did this, we got there, and my wife was getting ready to get out of the car and go around and open the door. Colonel Bank, at age 90, hops out of the car, runs around and opens her door before she could even get out. That's how spry the guy was. He used to power walk several miles every day, 3-4 miles every single day. And he used to swim in the ocean a couple of miles every single day. And one time he told me, Freddie says, they made me stop doing the power walking so much. I'm getting too lean. So he changed it. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, he power walked, and Tuesday and Thursday, he lifted weights at 90 years old. So that's not bad. He was a real physical fitness buff. But when we went out to March Air Base, the colonel was obviously the guest of honor and sat at the head table, and he sat with another distinguished person who we invited who lived in the area. And this was Colonel Lou Millett, Medal of Honor from Korea, the guy who led the last bayonet charge since the Battle of Cold Harbor. And it was quite a thing to see Colonel Millett and Colonel Banks sitting there back and forth, chatting back and forth from World War II to Korea, everything else. I mean, two superheroes, two people who will go down in history as the greatest soldiers that ever lived, and it was really great. Okay, in 1995, I moved back to New England. I got elected to the Board of Trustees at West Point and spent a lot of time over there and spoke to a lot of people, and one of them was Colonel Greg Wade, who was the head of the Department of Military Instruction, former Special Forces officer. Anybody here know Colonel Greg Wade? Greg Wade, okay, into the dustbin of history. We talked about Colonel Bank and said, you know, it'd be nice if we could get him out here to speak to the cadets. So I put my go-to-work hat on, and I contacted Jimmy Dean at National Headquarters. They said, we'll take care of the airfare back and forth for Colonel and Mrs. Bank. Chapter 12 said they'd get him to the airport out there. I came over from my home in New Hampshire, and I was his guide. He also had a bunch of cadet guides, and I was provided the transportation from the airport and everything else. So we got him back up there at West Point. First time he had ever been there. He spent 2 days there, and he got to see a practice parade, and I got to eat in the mess hall with the cadets, got the full tour of all the facilities and everything else. When we got to his talk, it's up in a conference room up there, a lecture hall. It's not like this, but it's one of the typical ones where the seats go up like this. So he's standing there and he's looking up at the audience. Colonel Wade introduces him. He goes up to the front of the room, turns around and looks up there, takes his cane, hangs it on the podium, and stands there and gives a 45-minute talk without notes. Colonel Bank is the most eloquent speaker I have ever heard, with the exception of Douglas MacArthur. That guy could tell a story, and I mean, he was inspirational. I once saw a video of him when they moved out of Flint Caserne in Bad Tolz. He gave a 10-minute talk, very, very eloquent, paused, and gave the exact same talk in fluent German. He was an amazing man. Well, at the end of the thing, after he gave his talk, opened it up for questions and answers. And one guy says, should the U.S. have even gone into Vietnam? Colonel Bank looks, he says, no. Everybody's eyebrows went up over their forehead. No. He says, for 3 reasons. Every uprising, such as we saw over there, if they had the following 3 elements, they were bound to win. One was there was a popular uprising. It was from the people. It wasn't something that the government forced on them. The people rose up, and Ho Chi Minh had them do that. By the way, Colonel Bank met and knew Ho Chi Minh at the end of World War II. I don't know that. He served with the Jedburghs in Germany and was on a mission to get Hitler, which was called off. And then he later was sent, at the very end of the war, was sent to Indochina, and he met and negotiated. He was the first guy to refuse Ho Chi Minh's request for help from the U.S. You haven't knew that one. But he said the first one is if there's a popular uprising. The second one is if they have a common enemy, and it was the French and then the Americans. To the Vietnamese, it was all the same thing. And the third thing is if they had help from an outside nation, a major nation. The VC had all 3 of those, and he said, we should never have been there. Well, the other question that really was an interesting one, the guy gets up and he says, sir, I've noticed that the shoulder patch for the 1st Special Service Force, the red one, is the same shape as the one for Special Forces. Does that imply that Special Forces was descended from the 1st Special Service Force? Colonel Bank looks at him, glares, and says, absolutely not. Jesus, I mean, I have never seen him get so emotional about it. Absolutely not. He says, we are descended from OSS and no one else. And he drove the point home. And that was where he was there. Now, in his book, how many have read this book, From OSS to Green Berets? Good, you guys are doing your homework, they're good. A lot of professionals here. At the tail end of that book, there's a passage that says, the part that's in blue, I don't know how well you can see it from out there, it says, the odyssey from OSS to Special Forces was complete. That's the last line in the last chapter. But if you go into the epilogue, it says, hence, it is quite obvious that the OSS deserves the distinction as the operational predecessor of Special Forces. So if there's ever any, I hear a lot of stuff and see a lot of stuff from SOCOM and these other authority headquarters that say, oh, we're descended, Special Forces gets part of its history from us. No, it does not. And that's proof of it. There's a copy of his book that he autographed for me, and we ended up being very good friends. We used to go down to his house, and Joni and I went to his house one Christmas, and he just regaled us with stories about being in Germany and being with the Jetbergs and everything else. It was a one-on-one. It was really a master class, and we used to correspond after that. We stayed on, even after the colonel passed away, we stayed as Christmas card buddies with Catherine for many years until just before her death, as long as she was still able to do that. And I probably got 6, 8, 10 letters that he sent. He loved to write letters. Of course, it was before the internet. But he loved to write letters and correspond with people, and he would tell me how they were doing. And the trip to West Point, he wrote letters beforehand to see if, by the way, his trip to West Point was delayed by a year because he fell and broke his hip. But he certainly came back okay and did a good job while he was up there. Okay, the last person we're going to talk about is, well, I did it again, Pete. What did I do? This pen, Sorry about that. Just as you do, okay, yeah, give me over that. Yeah. Okay, I'll get started on this one. The next guy is Robin Moore. Now, everybody knows that Robin wrote the book, The Green Berets. But Robin Moore was actually the guy that gave us our identity. He was the one that led us to be called the Green Berets, regardless of the fact that we happen to wear them. You never hear about the tan berets. You never hear about the black Stetsons. You never hear about the flat-top fatigue hats that we used to wear way back when. The Green Berets, it was the first time. In there. There we go. Good, right there. Good. Can you get it over there? Yep. Yeah, there we go. Okay. When I left Special Forces, I went over to the 82nd Airborne. It's the shortest PCS in the world. I drove down Riley Road. Instead of turning left to go to work, I turned right. So it was pretty easy. I went back over to visit some friends while I was there. And there is Robin Moore. I thought, who the hell is this guy? He looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy. It was kind of soft. He had been through Airborne, and he was getting ready to go to the UW school. Well, let me come back and make the point here. When I left the 82nd, I was in an artillery unit there, and they gave me this as part of the joke going away gift. Fred, once you got rid of that silly green hat, you turned out to be a pretty good artilleryman. Best of luck from the officers of the battalion. That's the way most of the Army still, in 1964, considered Special Forces, the guys that wore the silly green hat. The best thing they had to say about us was that we were snake eaters and sneaky Pete's. Those were compliments from the rest of the Army. Everything else they said was far, far worse. Well, Robin comes along, and this is what he looked like when I met him. And he put us on the map by doing 3 things. First, he wrote a book that told about the Green Berets, and he got in a lot of trouble for this. There's a guy, an assistant public affairs officer at DOD, a guy named Sylvester, hated him because he said, you're exposing a lot of top secret information. Well, the book was extremely, as you may well imagine, extremely thinly disguised. The hero in it is Larry Thorney, Larry Corney, an actual Special Forces officer, a phenomenal soldier. But the way they countered this is they pulled his security clearance. Well, all Robin did was label the book fiction and put it out anyway. But it was very, very close to what we were doing, especially the part that talks about mounting a raid going into North Vietnam and so forth. And Sante comes to mind after the fact when you look back at all this stuff. The second thing that and that book sold over 4 million, almost 5 million copies. So it was a hit. The next thing that happened was a song called The Ballad of the Green Berets. Now everybody associates that with Barry Sadler. They may not know that Robin Moore collaborated on the lyrics, and he made the arrangements to get a professional musician to write the melody. That was Robin's doing, not Barry Sadler's. Now there's one line in that song that is especially important. In the third verse it says, "Back at home a young wife waits, her green beret has met his fate." That's the first time that a Special Forces soldier has been by name referred to as a Green Beret. Before that, it was kind of a group thing. The guys who wear Green Berets and Green Beret type people and everything else. But this one, from that time on, that kind of got into the society, and it was, people started to identify. That song was #1 on the Billboard list of hits for 5 weeks in 1966. And if you go online right now, it is the #1 song for the whole year of 1966. With all the rock and roll, all the Beatles, all the other stuff that's in there, that is the #1 song for that entire year. Now the next thing that happened, oh yeah, and they wouldn't let him, write the cover notes. This Sylvester stepped in and used a little influence. So what they did instead, you can see right here, it says Sadler and Robin Moore. Sadler Moore right here. And so he took the credit. They couldn't take that away because he was a collaborator on writing the song. So the next thing was the movie. Movie had very little to do with reality or the book or anything else, but it was John Wayne and it was pro-military and everything else, and that was a hit. So those three things combined to make Special Forces a household word. Now, even today, on TV and in movies and everything else, you'll see this plot where there's something happens and some mysterious guy appears and he takes care of the bad guys, and you'll see he's in a fight and he takes out 10 guys in a fight, and he can fire every weapon, and he can fly a plane, and he can do everything else. A superhero. And then they wonder, who is this guy? And there's always this scene where they got a desktop and there's a folder on there, and they open the folder, and there's this picture of this real studly looking guy, handsome guy and everything else, and underneath it says in big block letters, Green Beret. I've been trying for years to get him to stop using my picture without permission. This is on the inside of the latest edition, of the last edition of the book. This is a note written by General Yarborough that says, to Robin Moore, who was a major factor in making the term Green Beret a household word both among his fellow Americans and around the world, with remembrance and gratitude. So Robin Moore is the guy, a civilian. He went through jump school, he went through UW school, he went to Vietnam. I checked with Steve Sherman. What team was Robin assigned to? He says, I think he was just an ambassador of goodwill at large and never had a real team assignment over there, but he was able to go from place to place and get the information he needed for his book. Well, in 1993, I moved back to the East Coast, as I mentioned, and joined Chapter 54. And by 2002, I was the president of the chapter. Well, who do I bump into up there but Robin Moore? He's a member of the chapter. He's been a member of the chapter for years. He attends all the meetings. He gets involved in all of the activities. He doesn't do a lot of the physical stuff. He was not well physically by that time. But I gave him a certificate for whatever it was. He took a trip to Afghanistan in about 2003 or somewhere around there. And when he came home looking like an Afghan. I call this picture Robin of Kabul. And, but I mean, he was so into Special Forces his whole life. He went to all the conventions. He was married at one of the Special Forces conventions. And the guys in the background there are guys from Chapter 54. He lived in Concord, Massachusetts. That was his home. And one that was particularly good, he acted as Santa Claus one year, and he's giving away copies of his book, The Singleton. Now we've got a guy here, where's Mike Lennon? Mike Lennon, right here, a co-author with Robin Moore of his last book. You gotta go talk to Doc Lennon. He is, he knew him better than I did, because he spent a lot more time directly with him. Robin, to me, he was a good friend. He was a guy that I was associated with. We'd get to the meetings early and sit down and tell stories about Fort Bragg and how it used to be and how the teams used to operate in Vietnam early on, you know, and he really enjoyed it. Well, when Robin died, they sent a contingent up from Fort Bragg, and it was, they sent the pallbearers and a firing squad. And I want to tell you, though, that contingent right there, that detail, those were the sharpest U.S. soldiers I think I have ever seen in my life. They were just, everything about them was perfect. Their uniforms, all of their decorations, they were all E6s, all CIBs, they were, I mean, just really sensational. And the sergeant that was, the master sergeant, that was the team sergeant that brought them up, his name was Sergeant, I think, Lau, or Loa, something like that, I don't remember it. But they were tremendous people. That picture right there, and seeing them the way they were, has led me to believe that I think even though the Army has gone back to the pinks and greens, which might be good for the regular Army, I think they ought to put the Special Forces back in a green uniform to go with the Green Beret. They ought to be totally distinctive. And it was good enough for John Kennedy to support a elite force. It's good enough for me too. This is what the book that Robin signed. Now, the part down below, I think he did earlier. You know, he had Parkinson's and he was didn't write very well. But this says, to Fred Rice, from something that says, with me at Fort Bragg in 1963. So he remembered that, and when we first met back there, he remembered that we had been at Fort Bragg, that I had met him there, because I was one of Nick's friends. And now, Robin Moore and Nick Rowe, they knew each other after his escape, but Robin had this belief that Nick Rowe was in Laos in 1961-2 under the guise of being a student at the Army Language School. And we had discussions on this, and I disagreed with him. I said, no, he was never there. Well, Robin sent me a letter one time that says, that refers to the script of a movie. And it says, you can see from this script that he was in fact there. And he says that Colonel Caravori and a bunch of other people vouch for this and so forth. Well, I had trouble breaking the news to him, but Nick and I saw each other every single day at the language school. My wife saw him every day. We went skydiving, we did our sports car racing and everything else. Nick never went anywhere. And a week and a half ago, I called Bill Bailey, who was his roommate while we were out at the language school. I said, did Nick ever go anywhere that nobody ever knew about? He says, not unless I was there with him, because I saw him every day and he never went anywhere. So Robin, I think Nick told him a story and yanked his leg. And again, he did it with that little Nick Rowe smile. So, what did I do again? Like that one. There you go. The last thing I want to show you was a real coincidence. I'm sorry for doing this to you. It's a good thing Pete knows what he's doing.
People know you, Pete.
It's almost the last one. There you go. There you go. Bingo. So Robin shows me one day, and I still have this, a movie script. And the movie script, the title of it is, guess what? High Risk Duty. I didn't have the heart to tell him. I didn't have the heart to tell him. But this was the same script that I had rejected along with Susan 10 years earlier. So Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to contact me for further information, I am also available. I'll come to your chapter if you'll pay the way, and I'll give a talk about Nick Rowe and all the other guys. I got a few other stories to tell too, but that's all I have. And now we can take any questions if you have them. Maybe I told you everything. But... Yes, sir.
When I signed in to SWIFT to go through Q in like 86, 87, Nick Rowe put a bunch of us E5s in a line and walked out and said, and handed E6 to him, and he says, "You're all E6s, now get out of my office." You know, and he had to smile. And then first group was in the Philippines in 88, 89, and he just walked right into the tent. We were having a meal and sit down, and he told us exactly what you said. He said, "I know what's coming. I sent the family home. I wrote the letters I needed to write to the people," and he left. And then we got the news that the assassination letters. Several years later, Billy Wall was.
Billy Wall.
Billy was in there, and he said, of all of my things I've done, of all the only regret I have, and it bothers me even today. I said, "What's that?" He says, "I was in the chase car on the other side of this building, and I couldn't get to it.
Wow.
And when we got there, it was too late." And that's been bothering Billy for years.
I think there are a million Nick Rowe stories. Anybody else have any questions?
Right here.
Right here.
On Sampson, chapter 59,
Yes.
I was at Fort Bragg and headquarters company, 7th Special Forces, when Riggs hated second lieutenants.
Yeah?
And I was the gatekeeper of his booze in the crypto vault.
He was we asked him one time why he had never made full colonel, and his explanation was he pissed in the whiskey too much. That was what he said, and that was him. He was a tough son of a gun.
He scared it all of us.
Oh yeah, he was a mean guy.
And Evan Smith was okay.
Is that it?
Yep, that's
okay,
it.
thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Hey, thank you, Fred. Hey, just to highlight a few, obviously Fred's here all week.
Can we put his contact information?
Yeah, I'll put it back on the screen. There's a military gathering that's for all of us here. We saw this back in August, and they're tailoring it to our group. It's a presentation from Carnival to honor everybody's sacrifice here in this room. Then at 12 o'clock in this lounge will be the Horse Soldier Story. 1300, the Team House. I've heard a lot of questions about Team House, and it affects every one of you in this room. So I hope you come back for that. And then a bunch of benevolent stuff at 2 o'clock. The Guardian of the Green Berets at 1500. 1700, the author event. And then every night on the cruise, there's 2 major production shows. And they're very well done, the singers and the dancers. So that way it enables you to go to early dinner and go to the late show, or go to the early show and have a late dinner. So they typically, like tonight's show, is at 7:30 and 9:30. So they try to do double of everything each day of the cruise to allow you to get with whatever gathering you want, to have dinner together and whatnot, and get good seats for that show. So military gathering, it's at the Normandy, deck 8 on the far forward end of the ship. Thank you.